I'm Chad Yakobson with Stave, and I'm here with your craft beer and brewing tip of the week. Where I always start is I start with the traditions. I am very passionate about Saison, old world Saison. It's fascinating within brewing how much we can be guided by history and tradition. If you're really into the history of farmhouse and Saisons, I highly recommend Phil Markowski's book on farmhouse ales. A lot of the information that we're going to talk about today, especially from a traditional standpoint, comes from that book, as well as another brewer in Belgium, Jovan de Beets. There's a wealth of knowledge when it comes to Saison. So at Stave, when we set out to create some of our first Saisons and our farmhouse ales, we were really inspired by the agricultural aspects that created the farmhouse ales. It's through these raw materials that we're able to look at the life of the beer and where they're going to go. Throughout this class, we'll often talk about farmhouse, Saison, and wild. They all have their origins in very similar places. The beer that inspires me immensely is the spontaneous lambics from Brussels. Over time, how that style evolved and changed, I think it's hard to say that there's not a link somewhere there between the spontaneous beers, even the Trappist beer of all, and these farmhouse ales and Saisons. The fascination with spontaneous beers and farmhouse and Saison, they really span the use of Brettanomyces, the use of wild, and it really comes down to a handful of things that, whether it's through evolution or just a change in philosophy, that define the beers. So today, talking about farmhouse and Saison, we're looking at brewers who were agrarian, brewers who were working throughout the spring, the summer, into fall, into harvest. These beers, they weren't being brewed as beers at a brewery. Today we now have Saison breweries. Back then it was villages, it was people who were malting the malts, sometimes unmodified malts, using those ingredients to then produce what was going to be the beer for the next year. At Stave, that inspired us to make two beers called VA and Surette. A VA means old, so a very important aspect of Saison is that Saison fermented for at least 6 months. It was often tart. It was also the hoppiest of Belgian beers. Just like the IPA brewers of England, it was recognized that putting hops in these beers had bacteriosteric properties and could stop a lot of that bacteria, a lot of that acidity from developing. There wasn't exactly a taste for highly acidic beers the way we might like those today in various wild beers and fruited sours. At the time, it was to produce something that could be drank through spring, through summer, into fall. VA, while being younger, was about 6 months old as it aged from fall into spring and would start to be drank. We think of these beers as being really low gravity, and to an extent that was true. There was also double Saison, as it was called. I believe it was anything over about 6.5%, maybe over 7%. And those were brewed here and there. And then also there was Surette. And Surette was the provision, or sort of the stock ale. So there would still be in the villages, if you were to go to, as we would call it, the pub, they would have the barrique, the barrels. And from there you could request Surette, which meant tart. So the provision or stock ales of Saisons, they were held back, but they were more limited. A traditional historic aspect to remember with Saison is that everything was fermented in oak barrels because that's what they had. The same way they were using the ingredients and the raw materials that they had. As you start to kind of look at the style, and even calling it style is difficult for me at times because it's really this family of beers as they were brewed by the brewers. As we have this evolution of Saisons, we start to think even in the modern era of a Belgian wit beer. This is a beer that still has its origins very closely tied to Saison. More wheat, more raw wheat, using coriander and orange peel. The beer, the fermentation, those characteristics, very much tied to that agrarian idea, just as Saison was. It's something that is very easy to embrace in breweries here in the US. There's a whole breakdown of spices, of adjuncts, of yeast strains even. That's something that's fascinating. In Belgium, it can often be said, there's only 3 yeast strains. As brewers here in America, we tend to break these beers out by the yeast strain. And today we're talking about really breaking them out more based on some ingredients and based on a creative level of thinking about the beers. That's where Brettanomyces comes in. It's a 5th ingredient, sort of breathes life into the beer, the same way even barrels can. If you want to learn more about brewing farmhouse style beers with Brettanomyces, click the link below.